Parsha Illuminated for Parsha's Terumah. So Parsha's Terumah begins with the command to gather donations from the Jewish people for the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the mini portable temple that they had in the desert, and and there's a major question as to when this command took place, this command to build the Mishkan, because we are coming off of the heels of Parshas Yisro and Parshas Mishpatim, which are basically the revelation at Sinai. Mishpatim has many laws in it, but it comes back at the end to talk about the events of the revelation at Sinai. Next week will be Parshas Tetzaveh. It's going to continue with instructions regarding preparing the Kohanim for the priests for their role in the Mishkan and their clothing and their garments. And then we'll go to Parshas Kisisa. And in Kisisa, we will have the sin of the golden calf, which followed the giving of the Torah at Sinai, 40 days later, approximately. So there we have the sin of the golden calf. And then we have two more parshas after Kisisa in the book of Shemos, and those are Vayakal and Pekudei, which come back to the building of the Mishkan and deal with the actual implementation of the commands that God gives in this week's Parsha and next week's Parsha, where Moshe then instructs the Jewish people and they actually bring their donations and they build everything, and then we come to the end of the book of Shemos. So it's a very interesting order that we find the different parshas here. We have the revelation at Sinai. We have now the instruction to build the Mishkan in Terumah Tetzaveh for how to do it, God commanding Moshe. Then we have Kisisa. Kisisa has many things in it, but the center piece of the parsha is the sin of the golden calf. And then we come back to actually implementing the instruction of building the Mishkan. So when did this instruction occur to build the Mishkan? So there's two approaches. One is that it occurred right now, before the Chet HaEgel, before the sin of the golden calf. And the other approach is it's actually not in order, and it occurred after the sin of the golden calf. Now, if you take that approach, then you would need to explain why it's out of order. Why does it appear now? We do have a concept in muktam umeuchar b'Torah. There's not a necessarily an order to everything in the Torah. In other words, sometimes things are out of order. When they are out of order, then it behooves us to try to explain why they're out of order, which is one of the reasons that that those who say it's not out of order here say it's not out of order, because why would it be in this order? So I actually don't have an answer for that today, but just presenting the two approaches. So approach number one that we'll discuss is that the command to build the Mishkan was only given after the sin of the golden calf. Before the sin of the golden calf, there perhaps was no need to build a Mishkan. There was no intention that they would build a Mishkan. The Sforno writes about this at the end of Parshas Yisro, right after the revelation, or still discussing the revelation. So the Torah says, I did not put this on the source sheet, but it says, Atem re'isem ki min hashamayim dibarti imachem. God says, you've seen that I spoke to you from the heavens. And then God says, do not make any idols along with me. And then it says, make a mizbach adama, just make a earthen mizbeach, an earthen altar. And the Sforno understands that at that point, that's really all we need to do is just build an altar wherever we want. Because then the Torah says, B'chol hamakom asher azkir eshmi, any place that you mention my name, avo elechta, I'll come to you, uveirachticha, and I will bless you there. And says the Sforno, after God reveals himself to us at Sinai, he says that now that you've seen that you don't need any intermediaries, I can reveal myself to you like I did at Sinai. So don't make any intermediaries. Lo sasuniti alo hechesef. Don't make any intermediaries. Don't make any gods of silver or gold. And all you need to do is mizbach adama tasali. Just make me an earthen altar. You don't need to make, says the Sforno, a temple of gold, a fancy heichal, a fancy temple of sorts, and of beautiful gems that I come to you. Just make a simple earthenware mizbeach, an earthenware altar, and or earth, made of earth actually, and that would suffice. And I'll come to you wherever. And really, the idea is that I'm coming to you. You have reached such lofty levels. Man is capable of achieving such lofty levels as we did at Sinai, that we don't need a temple, a Mishkan, or a Beis Hamikdash to bring God into our presence. We can really sort of set up shop wherever, and God will come to us. We will be the dwelling place of God's presence, just amongst us, wherever we might be. And that was the original plan. And then the singing of the golden calf happened. And after the singing of the golden calf, we sunk in our spiritual level. We declined, and post golden calf, there was now a need for a Mishkan. There was no longer that ability, that right to have God come to us wherever we might be, and therefore the command goes forth now to build a Mishkan. And this seems to be the approach that Rashi takes as well. Again, not necessarily coming off of the same verses, but Rashi, quoting Midrashim, later Rashi says that the Mishkan is called Mishkan HaEdus. The Mishkan is called the tabernacle of testimony. What does it testify to? Says the Midrash, it testifies that God has forgiven the Jewish people for the golden calf. And that's why it's needed. It's needed to testify that God has forgiven us. Following the golden calf, we were in trouble. We have sunk to such low spiritual levels. God says, here's a way out. Build me a Mishkan. I'll come back and dwell amongst you. And when my presence enters that Mishkan, that will be a testimony, an edut, that I've forgiven you. And that's why it's called the Mishkan HaEdus, the tabernacle of testimony. And the way that it atones, really, is we know that when the call went forth to gather things to create the golden calf, people rushed forward with their own materials, with their donations of gold, and produced the golden calf. We atone for that when we rush forth with donations to build the Mishkan, and the Mishkan acts as a means of atoning for the golden calf. And that's one approach. The Ramban suggests another approach to what the Mishkan was, and it seems from the Ramban, and it could be this is explicit somewhere, I don't recall. The Ramban is one who, whenever we want to invoke the rule or the lack of rule, that ein muktam u'meucher b'Torah, that there's no specific order in the Torah, that some things could be out of order chronologically, the Ramban says yes, but there needs to be an explanation for why it's out of order. And here he believes that it's not out of order. The Ramban believes that the Mishkan was always intended to be built following Matan Torah, following the giving of the Torah and the revelation at Sinai, because the Mishkan is meant to be a continuation, a perpetuation of what happened at Sinai. We mentioned this last week, or a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I think, in our shir, this idea that the Mishkan is meant to take God's presence from as it appeared on Sinai, and now have a place for God's presence to continue to dwell. And he writes that this is God tells us when we're standing at Sinai, he says, Atem tiulim amlechas kohanim v'gai kadosh, you're going to be a nation of priests and a holy nation, and therefore it's befitting that I should dwell amongst you, that I should have my Shekhinah, my presence amongst you, and therefore build a Mishkan. And the first thing that we're commanded to build in the Mishkan is the Aron, the Ark, because that's where God's presence appears. That's where God speaks to Moshe from over the ark. And that will be the place where the Shekhinah dwells most potently. And just as God appeared at Sinai, he would continue to appear to us in the Mishkan. And just as God taught Torah to the Jewish people at Sinai and to Moshe, first again, different explanation, different understandings for how many commandments we heard, but we heard directly from God. Some of the 10 commandments, all of the 10 commandments, and then God continued to teach Moshe Torah. Well, that would continue in the Mishkan. It's from the again, above the ark, the Aron, from between the Kruvim, the cherubs, that God would speak to Moshe and teach Torah. And so the Mishkan, in this sense, is a perpetuation of the situation, the experience that we had at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. Now, this actually can impact the understanding of what's included in the mitzvah, in the commandment to build the Mishkan. There is a work of the Rambam called Sefer HaMitzvos, the Book of Mitzvos, where the Rambam, based on our tradition that there are 613 mitzvos, the Rambam, Maimonides, tries to figure out what are the 613. We don't have a list anywhere. And the Rambam and others have done the same, makes a list. Now the Rambam names certain rules. What qualifies as a mitzvah? What can count on the list of 613? And what should we count as separate mitzvos? And based on his various rules, he comes up with what are the 613. Other things might be like corollaries of mitzvos, or just they don't count as a mitzvah, but they're still important. But what are the 613? Now, under mitzvah number 20, the Rambam lists the mitzvah to build the Beis HaMikdash, or to build a temple, to build a Mishkan. So in our Parsha, I put this on the source sheet, chapter 25, verse 8, Pasuk Ches, we have the Pasuk, the verse says, Ve'asuli Mikdash, V'shachanti b'socham, make for me a Mikdash, a sanctuary, and I will dwell amongst you. And the Rambam, based on this, in Sefer HaMitzvos, mitzvah number 20, the Rambam says, it's the second box, so the 20th mitzvah is, again, the order is not necessarily following always the order of the Parshas, but in his list, the 20th mitzvah is, Hishetzivanu livnos beis habechira lavoda. We're commanded to build a sanctuary to serve. And in that sanctuary, we will offer sacrifices. There will be an eternal flame. That's where we will go. Actually, I'm just looking now. The translation has offer our prayers. In the Hebrew that I got, doesn't say that, but it could be there's different versions of it in different translations. But it does say that we will go there and congregate there for the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimages, the 3 holidays. And that's the commandment, Ve'asuli Mikdash. Now, it's interesting that the Rambam defines the mitzvah in this way, right? He doesn't say the mitzvah to create a mikdash, to create a temple, is to build the temple, to get all the materials and build it. Part of the mitzvah, part and parcel, is to build a place that will be a place of avoda, of service, and a place that we will come to. It almost sounds like that's like part of the mitzvah is actually putting it into use. You haven't made a mikdash, you haven't made a temple if you just put up 4 walls, if you don't actually make it into a temple by using it in the way that it's meant to be used. And so part of the mitzvah of making a temple is you're going to make a place that will have in it avoda, offering, service of God. And it will have in it, it will be a place that we come to 3 times a year. That's part of the definition of building the temple, is actually making it into a temple by using it for what it's meant for. And then he writes that this Says we have already explained that this general term sanctuary includes many parts. The menorah, the table, the shulchan, the altar, the mizbeach are all parts of the sanctuary. Everything together is called by the name sanctuary, even though the Torah gives a distinct command for each individual element. And what he's saying is that there's one mitzvah. The mitzvah is to build a Mishkan. Part of building a Mishkan is also creating all the vessels for the Mishkan. But I'm not going to count them as separate mitzvahs. You're not going to find in my list of mitzvahs, mitzvah 20 to build a Mishkan, mitzvah 21 to build a menorah, mitzvah 22 to build an altar, to build a mizbeach. No, that's all included. All the vessels, creating the vessels, are all part of the mitzvah to build the Mishkan. That's part and parcel of building the Mishkan. That's what the Rambam writes. Now the Ramban, Nachmanides, or Moshe ben Naimon, has comments on the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, on Maimonides' Book of Mitzvos. And over here, the Ramban says that I don't agree. I don't agree that all the vessels are just a part of the greater mitzvah of building the Mishkan. Rather, no, they're not part of the Mishkan. His language is they're not chelek min habayis. They're not a part of the house itself. It's separate mitzvos, separate commandments, and they're not essential to each other. In other words, says the Ramban, that let's say you didn't have the vessels in the Mishkan. You didn't have the menorah, let's say. Well, could you still bring an offering on the mizbeach, on the altar? Yeah, you could, because you still have a Mishkan, and you still have an altar, even if you don't have a menorah, or you don't have the shulchan. So it's not part and parcel of the mitzvah to build the Mishkan. It's separate. There's build a Mishkan, and then there's a separate mitzvah to build a menorah, and a separate mitzvah to build, or it could be, I'm not sure if he counts each one separately, or he counts all the vessels are a separate mitzvah. I'm not sure. I have to look back at the way he says it, but it's definitely, there's the building itself, the edifice, it's one mitzvah, and then there's what's inside. The vessels are a separate mitzvah. And based on this, Rav Asher Weiss suggests that the Rambam, who's saying that it's all one big mitzvah, and the Ramban, who's saying that there's a separate mitzvah separating the edifice, the building, and the vessels within, are each going according to their understanding of what the primary purpose of the Mishkan was. According to the Ramban, the primary purpose of the Mishkan was to have a place that would perpetuate the presence of God that we had at Sinai, the Shekhinah, to have a dwelling place for the Shekhinah, for God's presence, just as we had at Sinai, to be able to perpetuate that. And so there's the Mishkan, there's the building itself, that's the dwelling place. And then separately, there's a secondary part of the Mishkan, which is it's also a place where we bring offerings, and we do service, and we light the menorah, and all those things, the different services. But it's like almost secondary in the view of the Ramban. The Ramban understands that the main purpose of the Mishkan is a dwelling place for God. A secondary purpose is the services that we do within the Mishkan, and therefore there's separate mitzvahs. One mitzvah is to build this edifice, to build a place, a Mishkan, a place where God's presence will dwell. And then a separate mitzvah, counted separately, is to build the vessels with which we perform the service. That's how the Ramban views it. However, the Rambam, if you look at his language, the way he begins this mitzvah, he says, "Hishatzivano livnos beis habechira la'avoda." The 20th mitzvah is that we are commanded to build a sanctuary la'avoda, for service. It sounds like that's the primary purpose of the Mishkan. It's to be a place to perform the temple service. That's the primary purpose. And therefore, if you don't have all the vessels that you need to do that service, to perform the service, then you don't have a Mishkan. Because the whole point of the Mishkan, or the main point of the Mishkan, is to be able to perform the temple service, to do the avoda. And therefore, the Rambam counts it all as one big mitzvah. It's one mitzvah. To build the Mishkan includes creating the vessels, because it's not a Mishkan if it doesn't have the vessels because the very purpose and essence of the Mishkan is to be a place where you can perform the avoda. And perhaps, I'm not sure, but perhaps the Rambam is taking the side that the goal of the Mishkan was to atone for the golden calf. And that's why he's focused on the avoda, on the service that's done, the atonement that the Mishkan can bring, because that's what it was meant for. It was meant, not like the Ramban. The Ramban saying the main purpose was to perpetuate God's presence, perpetuate the Shekhinah. The Rambam perhaps is siding with the Sforno and Rashi and those midrashim that they take, which is that the purpose was to atone, and therefore the purpose is avoda, it's service, it's atonement, and therefore the vessels that we use to do the service are part and parcel of the Mishkan itself. Okay. Let's turn now to talk a little bit about some of the vessels, and I want to specifically focus on their measurements. So we're going to learn a little math today. So we're going to talk about 3 of the vessels. The first is the Aron. So if you look in chapter 25, it says Ve'asu Aron, verse 10. This is actually the very next verse from where we left off. First, we have the command to build the Mishkan, and then right away it says Ve'asu Aron Atzei Shitim. They should make a Aron made of acacia wood. Amasayim v'chetzi arko. So it should be 2 amas and a half in length. Ve'ama v'chetzi rachbo, and 1.5 amas in width. Ve'ama v'chetzi komaso, and 1.5 amas in height. So let's just try to picture this. The Aron, the ark, was a box. It was actually 3 boxes, as it's going to go on to describe, but we're not going to see that inside. It was 3 boxes, one within the other within the other. The 2 outer ones were gold. Sorry, not the 2 outer ones. The outermost one was gold. Inside of that was a wooden box, and inside of that was another gold box. There were 3 boxes, but on the outside, these were the dimensions. It was 2.5 amas wide, or long, I guess, and 1.5 wide. So it wasn't a square; it was more like a rectangle, and then 1.5 tall. What's an amma? An amma, we usually translate to mean a cubit. It's like about an arm's length, and it's about 1.5 to 2 feet, and different opinions as to what it's supposed to be. Another way to define an amma is through the smaller measurement of a tefach. A tefach is a hand's breadth, and an amma is 6 tefachim, 6 hand's breadth, so about a fist. So it's about 6 fists. So that would mean that the Aron was 2.5 feet long. Sorry, not feet, amas. We'll come back to the hand's breadths later. I'll tell you why I bring that in. But it was 2.5 long, 1.5 wide, and 1.5 tall. Okay. Then we have the shulchan. The shulchan was the vessel upon which they had what they call the showbreads, the lechem apanim. And the shulchan, the Torah says, it's in verse 23, also was made of atzei shitim, acacia wood, amasayim arko. It was 2 amas long, ve'ama rachbo, and 1 ama wide, ve'ama v'chetzi komaso, and 1.5 tall. So it was actually the same height as the Aron, but not as large. It was 2 long and 1 wide and 1.5 tall. And then finally, the last thing we'll mention is the Mizbeach HaKatores. There were 2 altars. One was Mizbeach Hazav, the gold, or Mizbeach HaKatores, the golden altar. This is not mentioning our Parsha. It's mentioned, I think this is in Pekuda even. But it says there that this altar was V'asisa Mizbeach Miktar Katores Atzei Shitim Tasar. So again, it's made of acacia wood, and it was Amma Arko, the Amma Rachbo. It was 1 amma long and 1 amma wide. Ravua, so it was square. The Amasayim Komaso, and it was 2 ammas tall. Okay. So the Mizbeach HaKetores, where they brought the incense, it was 1 amma wide, 1 amma long, and 2 ammas tall. Okay. So what do we learn from that? What can we do with all these measurements? So 2 ideas I want to share. We'll begin with just a fascinating idea from the Maharal. So the Maharal is in his commentary to Pirkei Avos, and the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says as follows. It's on the source sheet, bottom of page 1. Actually, it's the only page, bottom of the only page 1. Gidola Torah Yoser min HaKahuna o min HaMalchus. Torah is greater than priesthood and kingship. Shehamalchus niknes b'shloshim ma'alos. Kingship is acquired with 30 stages, they say, 30 stages. V'akahuna be'esrim ba'arba, and priesthood with 24. V'hatorah niknes ba'arba'im u'shmona devarim. But Torah is acquired with 48 divarim, 48 things. Doesn't say malos, stages, but it says 48 things. So this is the Mishnah that then goes on to describe the 48 ways to acquire Torah, and it enumerates them. It does not enumerate the 30 ways of kingship or the 24 ways or stages towards priesthood, because it's not about that. It's just showing that Torah is greater, and then it lists off what the 48 ways of acquiring Torah are. Now, what are these stages of kingship or kahuna, of priesthood? What are we talking about? There's 30 stages of kingship. There's 24 of priesthood. So the Maharal says that there's a brisa. Brisa is like from the sages from time of the Mishnah that says that the 30 stages of kingship, they're not really stages. They are representations of the king's position. So they are silver and gold and wives and slaves and houses and fields and vineyards and a whole list, countries and officers and other just horses, and basically a whole list of 30 different things that basically express the king's royalty and wealth and position, soldiers, and some other, better things like justice and kindness and tzedakah. But these are things that show that demonstrate the king's position, basically, of royalty. And those are sort of 30 stages that describe a king. And then the 24 stages that describe a Kohen are what we call the 24 matnos kuna, the gifts that the Kohanim receive. So there's 24 different kinds of gifts that the Torah lists that the Kohanim could receive. So either parts of offerings or like Terumah, they get like a tithe from produce. Altogether, there's 24 different things, and that's what kind of separates the Kohen, the Kohanim, the priests, is by the special things that they can receive. And then there's the 48 ways that we acquire Torah. So says the Maharal that these are all hinted to in the vessels of the Mishkan that we just described. So these vessels that we talked about, which are the Ark, the Aron, the Shulchan, and the Mizbeach, there's something unique about the 3 of them that they share, which is that they all have a zer. A zer is like a crown. They all have upon them a little like pokey things going around, which are kind of shaped like a crown. What does that represent? That it's a keser, it's a crown. And the Gemara says that these represent 3 types of crowns that we could have. There's a crown of kingship, there's a crown of priesthood, of kahuna, keser kahuna, and there's a keser Torah, there's a crown of Torah. The Aron represents the crown of Torah. The Shulchan, which had the bread on it, which indicates wealth, represents the crown of the king, of kingship, of royalty. And the altar, the Mizbeach of Ketores, which had a crown, that represents the crown of kahuna of the priesthood. Now, each of these things are alluded to in their sizes, says the Maharal. If we go back, we'll just go in the order that he goes, so it's out of our order, but starting with the Mizbeach. So the Mizbeach, the altar, what were the measurements? So it was 1 amma by 1 amma. That's right, the third thing that we listed. 1 amma by 1 amma, if you go around the length and the width. So 1 amma by 1 amma, an amma, we said, is 6 hands breadths, right? 6 tfachim. 6 hands breadths equals 1 amma. So if you go all the way around 1 amma by 1 amma, it's really 4 ammas. To get around the Mizbeach is 4 ammas. Each amma is 6 tfachim. So that means there are 4 times 6 to get all the way around. There are 24 tfachim, 24 hands breadths to go around the Mizbeach. Well, the Mizbeach, which had a crown, represents the crown of kahuna, the Keser kahuna. And how many malos, how many stages are there to the priesthood mentioned in the Mishnah? 24. So there are actually 24 hands breadths to get around the Mizbeach, which had a crown, which is the Keser kahuna, which is the crown of kahuna. There are 24 tfachim to get around that. Next, the Shulchan. The Shulchan, we said, had the showbreads on it. It's the table. It had the bread on it. It represents wealth and represents the crown of kingship, of royalty, the Keser Malchus. Now, if you find, again, the shortest way around, so now it's going to change because we're not going to go around to the side. We're going to go over the top for the Shulchan, but it's the shortest way. So the Shulchan was an amma and a half tall and an amma wide. So that means if you go around the top and the bottom, so you're doing an amma and a half plus an amma plus an amma and a half plus an amma. So again, each amma is 6 tefachim. So, and there are 4 ammas, so it's 24 tefachim, but there are also 2 half ammas. And a half amma is half of 6 tefachim is 3. So you end up with 30 tefachim to go around. So again, it's 1.5, which is 9 tefachim, plus 1.5, another 9 tefachim, that's 18, plus 1 amma, which is 6, plus 6. So it's 30 tefachim to go around the Shulchan. And the Shulchan, again, represents Keser Malchus, the crown of kingship. And there are 30 stages to acquire the crown of kingship, alluded to in the 30 tefachim that it would take to circulate the Shulchan in the shortest way. And finally, we come to the Aron. The Aron, the ark, which contained the luchos inside, it contained the tablets. It also was the place where God spoke to Moshe and taught him the Torah. The Aron represents Torah. And so the Aron, how big was the Aron? The Aron, the ark was 2.5 ammas long, and 1.5 ammas wide. So 2.5 ammas is 6 tefachim plus 6 tefachim plus 3, right? Because it's each amma is 6 tefachim. So 2.5 would be 15 tefachim, but you have to do that twice because you're going around, so you get the length twice. So 15 plus 15 is 30, and then it was 1.5 on the other sides. So 1.5 is 9 each, is 18. So 30 and 18 gets us to 48. So unbelievable. To circulate the ark, the Aron, which represents Torah, is 48 tefachim around the Aron, around the ark, and there are 48 ways that mentioned in the Mishnah for acquiring Torah. So just an incredible insight that the Maharal discovers, alluded to in the dimensions of these 3 vessels, each one which has a crown, which represents a different crown, hinted to in their measurements are the means of acquiring them mentioned in the Mishnah, that there's 24 tvachim to circulate the Mizbeach of Ketores, which represents the crown of Kahuna, of priesthood. There are 30 tvachim to circulate the Shulchan, which has the bread, which represents wealth, the crown of kingship, and 48 tvachim to circulate the Aron, the ark, which represents Torah, the 48 ways to acquire Torah. Okay. One more idea to share about the sizes of these various vessels. So this comes from the Kli Yakar. Now the Kli Yakar points out that in these three vessels that we're describing, there's something that changes from one to the next. And that is that if we start with the Aron, so the Aron, the ark, it's 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5. They all are half measurements. They all end in half measurements. So the length and the width are 2.5 by 1.5, and the height is 1.5. They all end in half measurements, unfull measurements. The Shulchan, the table, it was 2 by 1 by 1.5. So it has a mix. It has 2 by 1. Those are whole measurements, whole amas. And then the height was 1.5, is half measurement. It ends in a half. It doesn't complete the amma. And then you have the Mizbeach, and the Mizbeach, they're only whole amos. They're only whole. It's 1 by 1 by 2, 1 by 1 length and width, and 2 high. They all end in whole amas. And the Kli Yakar says that the way that these measurements end in either halves or wholes are there to teach us something. And they're there to teach us the following. Like we mentioned, each of these vessels represents a different kind of crown that one can attain. And they each have to do with a different aspect of our relationship with the world and with God. The Aron being our relationship with Torah and wisdom, the Torah's wisdom. The Shulchan being our relationship with wealth and the material world. And the Mizbeach, the altar, being our relationship with the priests, but also with avoda, with service in general. So the Kli Yakar says that when it comes to our achievements in wisdom, in knowledge, in Torah, we always need to look higher, look above, and realize that we're incomplete. Realize that we have not. Look for those who are more complete than us. Look for those who are greater than us, and always be wishing and dreaming and striving to attain greater heights. We should never feel that we are complete that we've made it in our Torah wisdom, in our spirituality. There's always more that we can achieve. And that's why the amos, the measurements for the Aron, which represents Torah, they all end in halves. They all end in halves. 1.5 by 2.5, 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5, because we're never there. We're always a half. We're always there's always room to fill ourselves out, to complete ourselves when it comes to Torah, when it comes to our spiritual state, when it comes to our knowledge of God. We always have to realize that we're lacking, that we have more to achieve, more to attain. The Shulchan, though, the Shulchan represents material wealth. And the Shulchan, we had both types of measurements. We have half measurements, and we have whole measurements. And that's because, on the one hand, we need to be happy with what we have. We have to know we've been giving our lot, like Yaakov Avinu says, Yesh li kol, I have everything I need. I'm full. I don't need more. I have whatever God is giving me, and therefore we have whole measurements on the Shulchan. But we also have half measurements. Why do we also have half measurements? So explains the Kli Yakar, because that's what we should be aiming for. We shouldn't be aiming to achieve everything that we want, that we might dream of when it comes to the material. We should be happy holding ourselves back. We should hold ourselves back. We should restrict ourselves. We don't need everything. We don't need to get to everything. I'm good with a half measurement. I'm good with stopping there. And so we have this mix. On the one hand, we should feel full. On the other hand, we shouldn't be striving to fill everything. We should be happy and feel satisfied with halves. And finally, come to the Mizbeach. The altar is only whole measurements. Everything is whole. It's 1 by 1 by 2, and there's no half amas. And he says that's because that's actually true, I think, for both of the altars. We have the verse here about the Mizbeach HaKetoris, but it was true for the other altar also. They were all whole measurements. And that's because the purpose of the altar is to bring completeness to us. Meaning when we have sinned, then the altar, the Mizbeach, is there to atone for our sins and bring us back to a place of purity, a place of completeness, a place of where we're no longer broken by our sins. So it's to fix and repair and bring us back to a state of completeness. So therefore, the Mizbeach, which is the place of avoda, place of service, is all in whole measurements. So again, just to go through that, the Aron, the ark, which represents Torah, so that all the measurements are half, because we should never feel like we've made it. There's always more to strive for. We're always a half. I'm just a half, and we should look towards those that are greater than us and strive to attain their levels, and realize that there's always more to achieve, always more to grow, always more to learn, and always higher planes to reach in spirituality. When it comes to the Shulchan, which is about material wealth, so there we have both. We have the half amas, because we should be satisfied with a half, and we also have the whole amas, because we should feel whole. We should feel like we have what we need. And finally, the Mizbeach comes in only whole measurements, only whole amas, because that's what the Mizbeach does. It brings us completeness after we have done wrong. So it's a place that atones, a place where we achieve forgiveness from God and brings us back to wholeness, a sense of completeness after God forgives us for whatever sins we may have done. Okay, stop.
Thank you, Rabbi.